We all walk past them, the faces society has forgotten, the people whose stories we'll never know. We tell ourselves they made their choices, that their circumstances are somehow different from ours, that homelessness is something that happens to other people. Until the day when one of those invisible souls becomes the only thing standing between your child and tragedy. Vincent Henderson had lost everything that once defined him, his home, his career, his place in the world. But he'd never lost the part of himself that reached out when someone was drowning. On a scorching Atlanta afternoon, when a mother collapsed and her little girl's desperate cries went unanswered by a crowd of strangers, Vince didn't hesitate. He didn't think about his torn clothes or empty pockets. He just acted. Sometimes angels wear dirty clothes and sleep on cardboard. Sometimes the person you need most is the one you'd normally walk right past. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Centennial Olympic Park as Vince Henderson made his way to the bench he'd claimed as his own 3 years ago. His weathered hands clutched a paper bag containing day-old bread from the bakery on Auburn Avenue, the same bakery where the owner, Mrs. Chen, pretended not to see him rummaging through the dumpster each morning. She'd started leaving the bag on top instead of inside, a small kindness wrapped in the fiction of accident. 58 years had carved deep lines around Vince's eyes, lines that spoke of laughter from another life and worry from this one. His beard, more salt than pepper now, hung past his collar, unkempt but clean. He maintained what dignity he could in circumstances that stripped away most of it. The dog tags around his neck caught the light as he settled onto the bench. Sergeant Vincent R. Henderson, Medic, 3rd Infantry Division. They were the only things he'd never pawned, never lost, never let go of, even when hunger gnawed at his belly and winter bit through his worn jacket. Around him, the city stirred to life with the purposeful energy of people who had places to be, bills to pay, lives that mattered. Commuters hurried past with their eyes fixed on phones, their minds already at work, their worlds carefully constructed to avoid acknowledging his existence. He'd grown accustomed to being invisible, but some mornings the weight of it pressed harder than others. "Morning, friends," he murmured to the cluster of pigeons that gathered at his feet. Grey and brown and iridescent in the early light, they cooed and fluffed their feathers, unafraid of this gentle giant who never forgot to share his meager breakfast. "Got something good for you today?" He broke the bread methodically, his movements precise despite the arthritis that had settled in his joints. Army habits died hard. Even feeding pigeons required proper technique, he'd learned. Equal portions, strategic placement to avoid fights, always saving the best pieces for the smallest birds who couldn't compete with the aggressive ones. A businessman in an expensive suit walked past, coffee in one hand, phone pressed to his ear with the other. "Need those quarterly reports by noon, and I don't want to hear any excuses." His voice faded as he disappeared into the crowd, leaving behind the faint scent of cologne and ambition. Vince had worn suits like that once, though. Not as expensive. After his discharge from the army, he'd landed a job at a medical supply company, leveraging his training into decent civilian work. He'd had an apartment, a car, friends who invited him to barbecues on weekends. The transition from military to civilian life hadn't been seamless, but it had seemed manageable. Then Susan got sick. He pushed the memory away, focusing instead on the pigeons pecking contentedly at the scattered crumbs. The grey one with the missing toe always hung back, waiting for the others to finish. Vince made sure to save extra for him, understanding something about being overlooked, about surviving on the margins. "You remind me of someone," he told the bird softly. "Had a buddy in Afghanistan, Martinez, who used to wait until everyone else ate before he touched his MRE. Said his mama raised him that way. Good man." The words tasted bitter in his mouth. Too many good men hadn't made it home, and sometimes he wondered why he had. Survivor's guilt, the VA counselor had called it, back when he could still afford counseling. back when he still believed in getting better. The sun climbed higher, painting the park in shades of gold and green. Office workers began their lunch break. Pilgrimages to the benches, claiming spots for brief escapes from fluorescent-lit cubicles. Vince knew it was time to move. His presence made people uncomfortable during their precious free time, and he'd learned not to push where he wasn't wanted. He stood slowly, his back protesting after the long night on the cardboard bed behind the church on Peachtree. The pastor there, Reverend Williams, had never asked him to leave, but Vince tried not to abuse the kindness. Too many homeless camps had been shut down because someone took advantage, and he wouldn't be the reason others lost their sanctuary. Walk to the library took 15 minutes, threading through streets where he knew which shop owners would call security and which might spare a nod of acknowledgement. The Atlanta Fulton Public Library had become his refuge during the hot afternoons, a place where his appearance earned disapproving glances, but not immediate ejection. He'd claimed a table in the back corner, away from the families with children, and the college students with their laptops and dreams. Today, he pulled out a worn notebook, its pages filled with careful observations about the world around him. Weather patterns, the habits of other homeless individuals, the schedules of police patrols, the kindnesses and cruelties of strangers, all documented in the same precise handwriting that had once filled medical charts and incident reports. Mr. Henderson. The voice belonged to Janet, one of the younger librarians who'd started greeting him by name after he'd helped an elderly patron who'd fallen near the reference desk. "Reading anything interesting today? Just catching up on current events," he replied, gesturing to the newspaper spread before him. He'd already memorized most of it, but reading gave him purpose, made him look less like someone who was simply hiding from the heat. Janet lingered for a moment, and he sensed she wanted to say something more. She was young, maybe 25, with the kind of optimism that hadn't yet been worn down by reality. Sometimes she brought him coffee, claiming she'd accidentally ordered too many from the cart outside. "There's a job fair next week at the convention center," she said quietly. "Some of the companies are specifically looking for veterans." Vince nodded politely. They'd had this conversation before in various forms. Well-meaning people who still believed that hard work and good intentions were enough to overcome the complex web of circumstances that had landed him here. He appreciated the gesture, truly, but he'd learned that hope could be more painful than acceptance. After she moved on, he returned to his notebook, adding an entry about the family he'd observed earlier. Young mother, 2 small children, arguing with someone on the phone about rent money. He'd seen that look before, the hollow-eyed desperation of someone standing on the edge of the same cliff he'd fallen from. The afternoon stretched into evening, and Vince made his way to the soup kitchen on Martin Luther King Jr. Drive. Volunteers there knew him by name too, part of a community bound together by shared hardship and the understanding that dignity could survive even in the darkest circumstances. "Evening, Vince," called out Rosa, ladling beef stew into his bowl. She'd been volunteering here for 12 years, she'd told him once, ever since her own brother had spent 6 months on the streets after losing his job. "How are you holding up?" "Can't complain," he replied, the standard response that meant everything and nothing. Complaining served no purpose, and Rosa had her own burdens to carry. He ate slowly, savoring the warmth and the taste of vegetables that hadn't been rescued from dumpsters. Around him others did the same, a mix of ages and backgrounds, united by their shared invisibility to the world outside these walls. There was Jimmy, the Vietnam vet whose nightmares had driven away his family and his sanity. Maria, the former schoolteacher whose medical bills had consumed her house and her savings. Thompson, barely 19, whose aging out of foster care had left him with nowhere to go. They were all somebody's son or daughter, somebody's father or mother, somebody's hope that had somehow gone astray. Vince had learned their stories over shared meals and cold nights, recognizing in each one a reflection of his own fall from grace. After dinner, he walked the familiar route to his sleeping spot, checking the locations where he'd hidden his few possessions. A sleeping bag stored behind a loose board in an abandoned building, a change of clothes wrapped in plastic and buried in a park maintenance shed. Survival on the streets required careful planning and constant vigilance. As darkness settled over the city, Vince lay on his cardboard bed and stared up at the stars barely visible through Atlanta's light pollution. His dog tags caught the faint glow from a nearby streetlight, and he ran his fingers over the raised letters of his name and serial number. Sergeant Vincent Henderson, combat medic. Trained to save lives under the most difficult circumstances imaginable, now reduced to begging pigeons for companionship and librarians for acknowledgement. But tomorrow would bring another chance to matter, even in small ways. Another opportunity to share his bread with hungry birds, to offer a steady hand to someone who stumbled, to prove that dignity existed independent of circumstance. He'd survived Afghanistan and homelessness and the grinding indifference of a society that had forgotten him. He could survive another day. The heat pressed down on Peachtree Street like a living thing, shimmering off the asphalt in waves that made the afternoon air dance. Vince had found a sliver of shade beside a bus stop, watching the endless parade of humanity that defined downtown Atlanta during the lunch rush. The businessman who'd rushed past him that morning was back, now moving more slowly in the oppressive heat. His expensive suit wilted and his confidence diminished. Sarah Mitchell walked hand in hand with her 6-year-old daughter Maya, their progress slowed by the child's shorter stride and fascination with the street performers scattered along their path. Sarah's work badge identified her as the director of the Riverside Community Center, though she'd tucked it into her purse to avoid the constant stream of requests that came with being recognized in this neighborhood. "Mama, look at the man with the guitar," Maya said, tugging on her mother's hand as they passed a musician whose case lay open for donations. "I see him, baby. We need to keep moving if we're going to make it to the doctor's appointment on time." Sarah checked her watch. They were already running 15 minutes late, and Dr. Peterson didn't appreciate tardiness. Maya's asthma had been acting up again, triggered by the summer heat and pollution, and Sarah wanted to discuss adjusting her medication before school started. Vince noticed them before they reached his corner, the careful way the mother scanned. The crowd, the protective grip she maintained on her daughter's hand, the slight breathlessness that suggested they'd been walking in this heat longer than was wise. He'd developed an eye for vulnerability during his years on the streets, recognizing the signs of people who might need help before they knew it themselves. The collapse happened suddenly. One moment Sarah was checking her phone for directions to the medical building. The next she was stumbling, her face pale and clammy despite the heat. She tried to catch herself against a lamppost but missed, her knees hitting the concrete with a sound that made several pedestrians glance over before quickly looking away. "Mama!" Maya's voice cut through the noise of traffic and conversation, high and terrified. "Mama, get up!" Sarah's breathing had become rapid and shallow, her eyes rolling back as her body went limp. Heat exhaustion, Vince realized immediately, complicated by what looked like the onset of heat stroke. He'd seen it before in Afghanistan, where soldiers collapsed in desert heat that turned their bodies into furnaces. Around them, people slowed, but didn't stop. A woman in a Navy business suit pulled out her phone as if to call for help, then seemed to reconsider and kept walking. A man in a delivery uniform paused at the edge of the scene, looked around as if hoping someone else would take charge, then continued on his route. An elderly couple stopped completely, genuine concern on their faces, but their hesitation revealed they didn't know what to do. Maya dropped to her knees beside her mother, her small hands shaking Sarah's shoulders. "Wake up, Mama, please wake up." The desperation in her voice grew with each word, drawing more attention but no action. People formed a loose circle around them, phones emerging to record the drama, but not to summon help. Vince moved without thinking, muscle memory from 2 decades of military training overriding the social conditioning that had taught him to make himself invisible. His knees hit the sidewalk beside Sarah, his weathered hands immediately going to her neck to check for a pulse. Strong but rapid, her heart was working overtime to cope with the heat stress. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" He kept his voice calm and authoritative, the same tone he'd used when triaging casualties in field hospitals. No response. He turned to Maya, whose tear-stained face looked up at him with a mixture of hope and terror. "What's your mama's name, sweetheart?" "Sarah," Maya whispered. "Sarah Mitchell." "Sarah, I'm going to help you." He positioned her flat on her back, tilting her head to ensure her airway remained clear. His fingers found the pulse point at her wrist, still racing but not weak. "Not yet. I need everyone to step back. Give her some air." The crowd didn't move. If anything, more phones appeared, capturing the scene for social media consumption. Vince raised his voice, letting authority replace politeness. "I said step back, now." Something in his tone, the voice of someone accustomed to being obeyed in life-or-death situations, finally penetrated their fascination. The circle widened slightly, though the phones kept recording. Sarah's skin was hot and dry, her breathing becoming more labored. Vince pulled his worn wallet from his back pocket, extracting a laminated card that had survived 3 years of street life through careful protection. His CPR certification from the army technically expired, but the knowledge still sharp in his memory. "Maya, I need you to be very brave for your mama, okay?" He kept his voice gentle while his hands worked, loosening Sarah's collar and removing her light sweater to help her body release heat. "Can you tell me if she's been feeling sick today?" "She said she was hot," Maya said, wiping her nose with the back of her hand. "She kept drinking water, but she said it wasn't helping. Classic heat exhaustion, progressing toward heat stroke. Without intervention, Sarah's core temperature would continue rising until her organs began shutting down. Vince had seen strong soldiers die from heat injuries, and this slight woman wouldn't last long in the Georgia sun. He checked her pulse again. Weaker now, and her breathing had become irregular. No time to wait for paramedics who might take 10 minutes to navigate. Downtown traffic. He tilted her head back, lifting her chin to open her airway, and began rescue breathing. The first breath went in smoothly. Her chest rose and fell. The second breath met resistance. Her airways were starting to constrict as her body fought to manage the heat stress. On the third breath, he felt the change, the moment when her body began responding to the increased oxygen. "Come on, Sarah," he murmured between breaths. "Your little girl needs you to fight." A businessman stepped forward, finally moved to action. "Should I call 911? "Yes," Vince said without stopping his rhythm. "Tell them heat stroke, downtown Peachtree Street near the Macy's. Tell them she's unconscious but breathing with assistance." He continued the rescue breathing, counting in his head the way his instructor had taught him 25 years ago at Fort Sam Houston. 15 breaths per minute, steady and consistent, letting her lungs process the oxygen her body desperately needed. Maya crept closer, her small hand reaching out to touch her mother's arm. "Is she going to be okay?" "She's going to be fine," Vince said with more confidence than he felt. "Your mama's strong, and help is coming." Sarah's eyelids fluttered. A good sign. Her brain was getting oxygen again. Her breathing, while still shallow, began to regulate on its own. Vince reduced the frequency of the rescue breaths, letting her body take over, while remaining ready to assist if she faltered again. The crowd had grown larger, drawn by the drama and the novelty of actual heroism in the midst of their ordinary day. Someone had found a bottle of water and was pouring it over a handkerchief, offering it to Vince to cool Sarah's forehead. Another person had created makeshift shade with a newspaper, trying to protect her from the relentless sun. Sarah's eyes opened fully, confusion and disorientation clouding her vision as she tried to focus on the faces above her. "Maya," her voice was weak but clear. "I'm here, Mama." Maya squeezed her mother's hand, tears of relief streaming down her cheeks. The paramedics arrived with a rush of authority and equipment, their uniforms and professional manner causing the crowd to finally give ground. Vince started to back away. His job done, but one of the EMTs grabbed his arm. "You the one who administered aid?" "Yes, sir." Good work. Her vitals are stabilizing. The paramedic's name tag read Johnson, and his eyes held the respect of one medical professional for another. How long was she unconscious? Maybe 3 minutes total before I started rescue breathing. She's been responsive for the last 5 minutes. Johnson nodded, making notes on his clipboard while his partner checked Sarah's blood pressure and temperature. You saved her life. Another few minutes in this heat and we'd be looking at organ failure. As they loaded Sarah onto the gurney, she managed to grab Vince's hand. Thank you, she whispered, her eyes filling with tears. Thank you for saving me. Before he could respond, Maya threw her arms around his legs, holding on tight. Thank you for helping my mama. The moment should have felt triumphant, but Vince only felt the familiar weight of attention he didn't want. The crowd was dispersing, but several people were still recording, their phones capturing his face and his obvious homeless state. By evening, he knew, the footage would be online, with headlines about the homeless hero who'd saved a life on Peachtree Street. As the ambulance pulled away, Maya's small face pressed against the back window, her hand waving goodbye, Vince collected his few belongings and disappeared into the afternoon crowd. He'd done what needed doing, the way he'd been trained to do, but he'd also exposed himself in a way that made his chest tight with anxiety. He'd saved a life today. Tomorrow, he'd deal with the consequences. The video started appearing on social media platforms within hours, shaky footage captured by a dozen different phones from various angles. The headline that gained the most traction read, "Homeless hero saves mother's life while bystanders watch." By evening, it had been shared thousands of times, the algorithm feeding on the perfect storm of human drama, social conscience, and the comfortable moral outrage of people who could feel virtuous without having to act. Vince knew nothing about any of it. He'd spent the afternoon in his usual haunts, trying to shake the lingering anxiety that came with being noticed, with breaking the cardinal rule of street survival. Never draw attention to yourself. He'd found refuge in the library's quiet corner, his notebook open, but the pages remaining blank as he struggled to process the morning's events. The woman's name was Sarah Mitchell, her daughter, Maya. Those details had carved themselves into his memory with unusual clarity, joining the catalogue of faces and moments that sometimes visited him in dreams. But unlike most of the memories that haunted him, this one carried no weight of failure or regret. He'd acted correctly, decisively, and both mother and daughter were alive because of it. Still, the exposure worried him. Too much attention brought scrutiny, and scrutiny brought questions he couldn't answer without revealing more of himself than felt safe. Meanwhile, 40 blocks away in Grady Memorial Hospital, Sarah Mitchell was learning to breathe normally again. The IV drip had restored her fluid levels, and the cool hospital air had brought her core temperature back to normal. But the memory of collapsing on the sidewalk remained vivid and terrifying. "The man who helped you," Dr. Rodriguez was saying as she reviewed Sarah's chart. "The paramedics said he administered rescue breathing until they arrived. Probably saved your life." Sarah nodded, though the details remained hazy. She remembered the heat, the disorientation, then Maya's frightened voice calling her name. After that, fragments, gentle hands positioning her head, a calm voice telling her to fight, the sensation of air being pushed into her lungs when her body had forgotten how to breathe on its own. "I want to thank him," she said. "Do you know how I can find him?" Dr. Rodriguez hesitated. "The paramedics said he appeared to be homeless. He left before anyone could get his name." Maya, who had been coloring quietly in the chair beside the hospital bed, looked up. "He had a beard like Santa Claus, but skinnier, and his hands were really gentle. He saved your mama's life," Dr. Rodriguez told Maya with a smile. "That makes him a hero." "I know," Maya said matter-of-factly. "I want to give him a thank you." A card. The social media storm continued to build through the evening, fed by news outlets hungry for content that combined human interest with social commentary. The story had everything: a damsel in distress, an unlikely hero, a cute kid, and the uncomfortable subtext of how society treats its most vulnerable members. Channel 2. Action News ran the story during their evening broadcast, with anchor Monica Williams providing the narrative over the amateur footage. A homeless man became an unlikely hero today on Peachtree Street when he saved the life of a woman who collapsed from heat exhaustion, while dozens of pedestrians looked on and recorded the incident on their phones. This Good Samaritan provided life-saving first aid until paramedics could arrive. The report included interviews with several witnesses, each eager to share their version of events. "It was incredible," said Jennifer Walsh, a marketing executive who'd been among the crowd. "Everyone was just standing around, but this man knew exactly what to do. He was so calm and professional. Made me think about how we just walk past homeless people every day," added Marcus Thompson, a construction worker who'd been on his lunch break. "This guy probably saved that lady's life, and most of us wouldn't have even looked at him twice." The comment sections exploded with responses ranging from genuine admiration to cynical skepticism to political grandstanding. Some praised the unnamed hero's selfless action. Others questioned why so many people had phones ready to record, but nobody had called 911 immediately. A few suggested the whole thing might have been staged, but the story that resonated most powerfully was simpler than any of the social commentary. A man with nothing had given everything he could to help a stranger. In a world that often felt increasingly cruel and disconnected, the image of someone kneeling on hot concrete to breathe life into another human being struck a chord that transcended politics and cynicism. Sarah was released from the hospital that evening with strict instructions to avoid heat exposure and maintain proper hydration. Maya had fallen asleep in the passenger seat before they'd left the parking garage, exhausted by the day's trauma and the sterile anxiety of the hospital environment. As Sarah drove home through the familiar streets of her neighborhood, she found herself looking at the homeless individuals she passed with new eyes. The man at the freeway off-ramp with his cardboard sign, the woman pushing a shopping cart filled with her possessions. The group gathered around the warming fire behind the abandoned gas station. Any one of them might be the person who'd saved her life. At home, she helped Maya into her pajamas and tucked her into bed, but sleep eluded them both. Maya had questions that Sarah couldn't answer. Why hadn't other people helped? Where did the man live? Was he hungry? Could they bring him dinner? "Tomorrow," Sarah promised, though she had no idea how to fulfill that commitment. "Tomorrow, we'll try to find him and say thank you properly." Maya seemed satisfied with that answer, but Sarah lay awake long after her daughter's breathing had settled into the rhythm of sleep. The doctor had been clear. Without immediate intervention, her heat stroke could have progressed to organ failure within minutes. She could have died on that sidewalk, leaving Maya orphaned simply because she'd underestimated the danger of walking 6 blocks in 90-degree heat. She thought about the man's hands, surprisingly clean despite his obvious poverty, steady and confident as they'd checked her pulse and positioned her head. He'd known exactly what to do, which meant he'd been trained, which raised questions about how someone with medical knowledge had ended up living on the streets. The video notifications kept coming throughout the night, friends and colleagues sharing the footage with messages of concern and amazement. "Is this you? Are you okay? Can you believe this homeless guy was a hero?" By morning, the story had reached national attention. CNN picked it up for their Good News segment. The Today Show ran a brief piece about ordinary heroes. Social media influencers began weighing in with their thoughts about homelessness, heroism, and the state of American society. Everyone wanted to talk about the man who'd saved Sarah's life. The only person who remained silent was the man himself, still unaware that his act of simple human decency had become a symbol of everything right and wrong with the world. But that ignorance wouldn't last much longer. Stories like this had a way of finding their protagonists, whether they wanted to be found or not. The first sign that something had changed came when Mrs. Chen at the bakery actually spoke to him. Vince had been making his morning rounds, checking for the paper bag she usually left on top of the dumpster, when she emerged from the back door with a full bag of yesterday's pastries and a cup of coffee that was still steaming. "You did good." "The thing yesterday," she said in her careful English, pressing both items into his surprised hands. "Very good thing." Before he could respond, she disappeared back inside, leaving him standing in the alley with more food than he'd seen in weeks, and the unsettling realization that somehow his anonymity had been compromised. The coffee was still. Warm, cream and sugar added just the way he'd watched other customers order it. The pastries included items from the expensive display case, bear claws and Danish that cost more than he usually found in spare change over the course of a week. Mrs. Chen's kindness was genuine, but it raised questions he wasn't ready to answer. At the library, the changes were more subtle but equally unsettling. Janet, the young librarian who'd occasionally brought him coffee, smiled more brightly than usual and lingered near his table longer than necessary. 2 other patrons nodded at him, actual acknowledgement from people who'd previously looked through him as if he were invisible. "Quite a story making the rounds on social media," Janet said as she reshelved books nearby, about a homeless veteran who saved a woman's life downtown. Vince kept his eyes on his notebook, but his hand had stopped writing. "Is that so? The video's been shared thousands of times. Everyone's calling him a hero." She paused, clearly hoping he'd respond, but he remained silent. "I think it's wonderful when people look out for each other, don't you? World could use more of that," he agreed carefully. He'd avoided looking at the computer terminals, reluctant to confront whatever version of yesterday's events was spreading across the internet. But Janet's comments confirmed his fears. Someone had recorded the incident, and the footage was circulating beyond his control. That afternoon, the consequences became more apparent. 3 different news vans had set up along Peachtree Street, near the scene of the rescue, their crews interviewing pedestrians and business owners about the homeless hero story. Vince spotted them from a distance and altered his route, unwilling to risk recognition, but avoiding the news crews meant avoiding his usual spots, disrupting the careful routine that had kept him stable for 3 years. Instead of his familiar bench in the park, he found himself in unfamiliar territory, hyper-aware of every glance from passers-by, every phone that might be recording his face. The paranoia wasn't entirely unfounded. By evening, someone had identified the hospital where Sarah and Maya had been taken, and reporters were camping outside Grady Memorial, hoping for interviews. Sarah had been discharged the previous evening, but the attention had followed her home. "Mama, there are people with cameras outside," Maya announced from her perch at the living room window. Sarah closed her eyes, recognizing that their quiet life had been permanently altered by yesterday's events. As director of the Riverside Community Center, she was accustomed to some level of public attention, but this was different. This was invasive, relentless, and focused on a story that wasn't really hers to tell. The phone had been ringing all morning, reporters wanting interviews, friends wanting details, colleagues expressing concern and curiosity. She'd stopped answering. After the 5th call from a producer who wanted to reunite her with her hero for a live television segment, Maya had spent the morning working on something at the kitchen table, her tongue poking out in concentration as she wielded crayons with the serious dedication of a 6-year-old on a mission. When she finally held up her creation, Sarah's throat tightened with emotion. The drawing showed 3 figures on a sidewalk, a woman lying down, a small girl standing nearby, and a tall man with a beard kneeling beside them. Above the scene, Maya had written in her careful first-grade handwriting, "Thank you for saving my mama." "It's beautiful, baby," Sarah said, sitting down beside her daughter. "What do you want to do with it?" "Give it to him," Maya said simply. "The man who helped you. He should know that I'm grateful." The problem, of course, was finding him. Sarah had called the hospital to see if they had any contact information, but the paramedics had only reported that a homeless individual had provided aid before disappearing into the crowd. The police had no record of anyone filing a report, and the news crews had been equally unsuccessful in identifying the mystery hero. But Maya's drawing had given Sarah an idea. As director of the Riverside Community Center, she had connections throughout the city's network of homeless services. If anyone could help her find the man who'd saved her life, it would be the social workers, shelter operators, and outreach coordinators who actually knew the people living on Atlanta's streets. She made her first call to David Martinez, who ran the men's shelter on Memorial Drive. "I'm looking for someone," she explained, describing the man from yesterday's incident. Older, maybe late 50s, graying beard, appeared to have medical training. "Could be any of a dozen guys," David replied. "But medical training narrows it down. We've got a few veterans with healthcare backgrounds. There's Tommy Williams, used to be a paramedic before he lost his house. Or maybe Jerome Washington, he was a Navy corpsman. This man knew CPR, responded like he'd done it before. Military training, probably. I'll ask around, see if anyone knows who you're talking about. But Sarah, you need to understand, a lot of these guys don't want to be found, especially if they're getting attention they didn't ask for." The same message came from every contact she made. The homeless community was insular, protective of its members, and deeply suspicious of outsiders who came looking for specific individuals. Even with the best intentions, Sarah's search was viewed with skepticism by people who'd learned to be wary of anyone asking questions. Meanwhile, Vince had found temporary refuge in a part of the city he rarely visited, an industrial area near the railroad tracks where other homeless individuals gathered in the shadow of abandoned warehouses. The community here was different from his usual haunts, younger, more transient, with less tolerance for the quiet routine that had sustained him. "You're the guy from the video, aren't you?" The question came from a woman in her 30s. Her hair dyed an unnatural shade of red and her arms covered in tattoos that told stories of better times. The one who saved that lady. Vince had been hoping his changed location would provide anonymity, but apparently his face was recognizable even here. "I helped someone who needed help," he said carefully. "Shit, man. You're famous. My cousin in Detroit sent me the link, said it was going viral." She studied his face with the calculating look of someone trying to determine if association with him might bring benefits or trouble. "You gonna cash in on this?" "Cash in on what?" "The fame, the attention. People love this kind of story. You could probably get on talk shows, maybe write a book or something." The idea was so foreign to Vince's thinking that he almost laughed. 3 years of invisibility had taught him to measure success in terms of survival. A safe place to sleep, enough food to keep going, enough anonymity to avoid trouble. The concept of leveraging his momentary heroism for personal gain felt like a betrayal of everything he'd learned about dignity and adversity. "I just want to be left alone," he said. But even as the words left his mouth, he knew that wish was probably impossible now. The video had made him a symbol, and symbols belonged to the public in ways that private citizens didn't. Whether he wanted the attention or not, his actions had thrust him into a conversation about homelessness, heroism, and the social contract that bound communities together. Somewhere across the city, a little girl was coloring thank you cards for a man she'd met for 5 minutes but would remember for the rest of her life. Her mother was making phone calls, trying to bridge the gap between her middle-class world and the invisible community that had produced her savior. And Vince was learning that some acts of kindness echoed longer and louder than anyone expected, changing not just the lives they touched directly, but the conversation around them in ways that couldn't be controlled or contained. Sarah's determination grew stronger with each passing day, fueled by Maya's unwavering faith that they would find the angel man, and Maya's carefully crafted thank you card that now lived on their refrigerator like a daily reminder of their mission. The drawing had evolved over the week, Maya adding details she remembered or imagined, until the bearded figure in the picture had become almost mythical in his kindness. "He had sad eyes," Maya announced over breakfast, adding another memory to her growing catalogue. But they got happy when I hugged his legs. Sarah's search had expanded beyond phone calls to actual fieldwork. Armed with Maya's drawing and her own determination, she'd begun visiting the places where Atlanta's homeless population gathered. Soup kitchens, day shelters, the underpasses where camps formed and dissolved with the rhythms of police sweeps. And weather patterns. The Riverside Community Center's outreach van made regular runs to these locations, distributing supplies and connecting people with services, so Sarah's presence wasn't entirely unusual. But her specific mission, searching for one particular individual rather than helping whoever needed assistance, marked her as different from the usual volunteers and social workers. "You're looking for Army Medic," said Rosa, the woman who ran the soup kitchen where Sarah had started her search. "That narrows it down some. We get a lot of veterans, but not so many with medical training." Rosa had been serving meals to Atlanta's homeless population for 12 years, and her network of informal intelligence was more comprehensive than any official database. If someone was living rough in the city, she either knew them personally or knew someone who did. "Tommy Williams might be your guy," she continued, wiping down the serving counter as the lunch crowd dispersed. "About the right age, Army background, knows first aid. But Tommy's got red hair, not brown, and he's been up in Chattanooga visiting his sister." "What about the man who sleeps behind St. Luke's?" suggested Carlos, one of the regular volunteers. "Older guy, keeps to himself, always polite when he comes in for meals." "That's Jerome," Rosa said. "Navy, not Army. And Jerome doesn't know CPR. I asked him to help when Mrs. Patterson had her episode last month, and he said he wasn't trained for that kind of thing. Each lead seemed promising until the details eliminated it." Sarah was learning that Atlanta's homeless community was larger and more diverse than she'd realized, full of individuals with complex stories that defied the simple narratives she'd carried in her head. Meanwhile, Vince's attempts to disappear had become increasingly difficult. The video had achieved the kind of viral status that transcended social media, spreading through email chains and traditional news outlets until his face was recognizable to people who'd never heard of Twitter or Instagram. He'd been recognized at the library, forcing him to abandon his usual refuge. The bakery's kindness had attracted attention from other business owners, some genuine in their desire to help, others hoping to capitalize on association with the homeless hero story. Even the soup kitchen had become problematic. Too many volunteers asking questions, too many curious glances from other patrons who'd put together his identity. "You're him, aren't you?" The voice belonged to Pete, a Vietnam veteran who'd been living rough for 15 years and normally kept his observations to himself. They were sharing space under a highway overpass, far from Vince's usual territory, but apparently not far enough. "I'm just trying to keep my head down," Vince replied. "Ain't gonna happen, brother. Once they get your scent, they don't let go." Pete spat into the darkness beyond their makeshift camp. "Had my 15 minutes back in '98 when I pulled those kids out of the car accident on 285. Reporters, do-gooders, people wanting to fix my life whether I asked for it or not. What happened? Eventually they moved on to the next story, but it took months. And by then I'd lost 2 good sleeping spots and a job washing dishes at a diner downtown because the owner got tired of reporters bothering his customers." Pete's story was a cautionary tale that confirmed Vince's worst fears about unwanted attention, but it also contained a grain of hope. Eventually the media would find new heroes to celebrate and new stories to tell. The key was surviving until then. "Best thing you can do is control the narrative," Pete advised. "Give them one interview, say your piece, then disappear for real. Otherwise, they'll keep making up stories about you, and those stories might not be ones you like." The advice made sense, but it required a level of engagement with the world that Vince had been avoiding for 3 years. Dealing with reporters meant answering questions about how he'd ended up homeless, about his military service, about the life he'd lost, and the man he'd been before the streets claimed him. Those were conversations he wasn't ready to have. Sarah's search had taken on. the methodical intensity she brought to her work at the community center. She'd created a map of Atlanta's homeless services, marking locations where she distributed flyers with Maya's drawing and a simple message. Looking for the man who saved my life on Peachtree Street. Please call if you know him. The responses had been disappointing. Plenty of people remembered the video, and everyone had opinions about the story, but nobody could provide concrete information about the mystery hero's identity or whereabouts. Maybe he doesn't want to be found, suggested her assistant director Marcus as they reviewed the week's outreach reports. Some folks value their privacy, even when they're homeless. He saved my life, Sarah replied, the same response she'd given to everyone who questioned her dedication to the search. The least I can do is thank him properly. But Maya's motivation was simpler and more pure. She'd begun including the angel man in her bedtime prayers, asking God to keep him warm and fed and to help them find him so she could give him his thank you card in person. Do you think he has little girls? Maya asked one evening as Sarah tucked her into bed. I don't know, baby. Why do you ask? Because he was so nice to me, like he understood about being scared for your mama. The insight was more perceptive than Sarah had expected from a 6-year-old, but it highlighted something she'd noticed in her search through the homeless community. Many of the individuals she'd met had families somewhere, children and grandchildren. They'd lost touch with through circumstances beyond their control. The man who'd saved her life wasn't just a symbol or a story. He was someone's son, possibly someone's father, a human being whose life had intersected with theirs for 5 crucial minutes before diverging again into invisibility. But invisibility, Sarah was learning, was becoming harder to maintain in a world where every phone contained a camera and every dramatic moment became potential content for the endless hunger of social media. Whether her angel man wanted to be found or not, the search would continue. Maya's faith demanded it, and Sarah's gratitude required it, and somewhere in the vast anonymity of Atlanta's streets, a man who'd asked for nothing but solitude was about to discover that heroism came with a price he'd never agreed to pay. The closest they came to finding each other happened on a Thursday morning when both Sarah and Vince were standing in line at the Salvation Army Outreach Center on Marietta Street, separated by no more than 20 feet and a crowd of people seeking various forms of assistance. Sarah had come following a tip from Rosa at the soup kitchen, who'd heard from someone else that a man matching her hero's description sometimes picked up mail at the center's general delivery service. Maya was at school, which meant Sarah could pursue leads that might take her into areas she wouldn't normally bring her daughter. Vince had come for the same reason he'd been visiting the center sporadically for 2 years, to check for any correspondence from the Veterans Administration regarding his disability claim, a bureaucratic process that moved with glacial slowness and required an address he didn't possess. The irony was that they were both in line for mail, Sarah clutching a flyer with Maya's drawing while Vince waited with the worn envelope containing his military discharge papers and medical records. If either had turned at the right moment, if the crowd had shifted differently, if any of a dozen small circumstances had aligned, their search might have ended that morning. Instead, Vince collected his mail. No letters from the VA, but a forwarded notice from a medical appointment he'd missed 6 months ago and left through the rear exit to avoid the growing crowd at the front entrance. Sarah reached the counter 5 minutes later, only to learn that the staff couldn't provide information about specific individuals, even to someone with the best intentions. Privacy laws, explained the volunteer at the desk, an elderly woman whose kind eyes suggested she genuinely wanted to help. We can't tell you if someone gets mail here or not, but if you want to leave a message, we can add it to our bulletin board. Sarah pinned Maya's flyer to the crowded corkboard, nestled between job listings, apartment wanted ads, and missing person notices. It would remain there for 3 weeks before being removed to make room for newer postings, unseen by the man it was meant to find. The near miss was repeated throughout the week as Sarah's search intensified and Vince's movements became more erratic in response to the unwanted attention. They passed within a block of each other outside the central library when Sarah was interviewing homeless individuals and Vince was scouting alternative locations after being recognized by too many regular patrons. At the free medical clinic on Auburn Avenue, they missed each other by 15 minutes, Sarah arriving to ask if any of the volunteer doctors remembered treating a homeless man with medical training. Vince leaving after having his blood pressure checked and his persistent cough examined by a physician who urged him to come back if the symptoms worsened. The closest call came at the Riverside camp, where some of Atlanta's homeless population had established a semi-permanent community in the shadow of the interstate bridges. Sarah had heard rumors of a veteran with medical knowledge who helped treat injuries and illnesses among the camp residents, and she'd convinced Marcus to escort her for a visit that required careful negotiation with the camp's informal leadership. "You looking for Doc?" asked a woman in her 40s, whose weathered face and missing teeth testified to hard years on the streets. "He don't like visitors much, but he's good people." Sarah's heart raced at the possibility that she'd finally found the right lead. "Is he here now?" "Nah, he only comes by when someone needs patching up. Got called out yesterday to help with Tommy's infected foot. Might be back tomorrow, might not." But Vince wasn't coming back to the Riverside camp. Word had reached him through the invisible network that connected Atlanta's homeless population that someone was asking questions about him specifically. The description had been accurate enough. Older veteran, medical training, helped save a woman downtown, that he'd known immediately he was the target of the search. The revelation brought mixed emotions. Part of him was curious about why the woman he'd helped was looking for him, though he could guess it was probably gratitude-motivated. But a larger part was concerned about the implications of being found, about having his carefully constructed anonymity stripped away by good intentions. He'd moved his sleeping location 3 times that week, abandoning familiar spots for unfamiliar territory that left him vulnerable to different dangers, but provided temporary invisibility from whatever forces were trying to locate him. The mental toll was exhausting. 3 years of homelessness had taught him that survival required routine, familiarity, and the kind of low-profile existence that kept him safe from both predators and authorities. The disruption to that routine was wearing him down in ways that transcended mere inconvenience. Meanwhile, Sarah's colleagues at the community center had begun questioning her dedication to what some saw as an increasingly quixotic quest. Her assistant director Marcus had been supportive initially, but as the search stretched into its 2nd week without results, he'd started expressing concerns about priorities. "I understand wanting to thank him," Marcus said during their weekly staff meeting, "but maybe it's time to consider that he doesn't want to be found. We've got real cases that need attention. The Peterson family still needs housing assistance, the youth employment program is understaffed, and we've got 3 new domestic violence referrals this week." Sarah knew Marcus was right from a practical standpoint. Her role as director required her to balance resources and attention across multiple programs and dozens of families who depended on the center's services. But Maya's unwavering faith in finding the angel man had become a driving force that transcended rational resource allocation. "1 more week," Sarah promised. "If we don't find him by then, I'll scale back the search." But even as she made the commitment, she doubted her ability to keep it. Maya had added new details to her drawing, a sun shining down on the 3 figures, flowers growing from the sidewalk where they'd met, the word hero written in her careful 1st-grade lettering. Above the man's head, the artwork had become more than a thank you card. It was a child's way of processing trauma and finding meaning in a moment of terror. Maya needed to deliver that card as much as Sarah needed to express her gratitude. The search would continue, even if it meant pursuing a man who clearly didn't want to be found, even if it meant disrupting his life in ways she couldn't fully understand. Sometimes gratitude was selfish, demanding expression regardless of whether the recipient wanted to receive it. And somewhere in Atlanta's vast network of streets and shelters and forgotten spaces, a man who'd saved 2 lives by acting on instinct and training was discovering that heroism was a burden he'd never asked to carry, one that followed him even into the corners where society's forgotten people tried to make themselves invisible. The game of near misses would continue until circumstances aligned to make hiding impossible and finding inevitable, until the weight of a little girl's gratitude overcame a grown man's desire for anonymity. The meeting happened by accident, the way most important encounters do, not through careful planning or systematic searching, but through the random intersection of 2 lives following their own separate trajectories toward an inevitable collision. Sarah had given up on the systematic approach after 2 weeks of dead ends and near misses. Instead, she'd begun incorporating her search into her regular work routine, carrying Maya's drawing with her during community outreach visits and asking casual questions whenever the opportunity arose. It felt less desperate this way, more like a natural part of her job, serving Atlanta's most vulnerable populations. On this particular afternoon, she'd brought supplies to the informal camp that had formed behind the abandoned textile warehouse. On Memorial Drive, the residents here were different from the more visible homeless population downtown. Older, more established in their routines, less trusting of outsiders offering help. But they needed services as much as anyone, and Sarah had been working to build relationships that might eventually lead to housing placements or medical care. She was distributing hygiene kits and information about the community center's programs when she noticed a man sitting apart from the others, his back against a chain-link fence, methodically cleaning what appeared to be a small collection of tools. His concentration was absolute, each implement receiving careful attention before being wrapped in cloth and returned to a worn canvas bag. Something about his posture struck her as familiar, the straight shoulders that spoke of military training, the careful economy of movement that suggested someone accustomed to making do with little. When he looked up at her approach, she found herself staring into the same gentle eyes that had watched over her as she'd fought to breathe on a downtown sidewalk. "It's you," she said, the words tumbling out before she could consider their impact. Vince's first instinct was to run. 2 weeks of avoiding this exact scenario had prepared him for flight, but something in Sarah's expression, not triumph or vindication, but simple recognition and relief, kept him frozen in place. "Ma'am," he said carefully, defaulting to the courtesy that had been drilled into him decades ago. "My name is Sarah Mitchell. You saved my life on Peachtree Street." She sat down on the ground across from him, ignoring the curious glances from other residents of the camp. "I've been looking for you. I figured as much." Vince's hands continued their work on the tools, the familiar routine providing stability. In a moment that felt suddenly precarious, "Word gets around." Sarah reached into her purse and pulled out Maya's drawing, now laminated for protection and showing signs of being handled frequently. "My daughter made this for you. She's been asking every day when we could give it to you." The artwork was more elaborate than Vince remembered from their brief encounter, filled with details that spoke of a child's attempt to process and honor a significant moment. He accepted it carefully, studying the careful lettering that spelled out, "Thank you for saving my mama. She drew me bigger than I am," he observed, a small smile creasing his weathered features. "That's how she sees you, how we both see you." Sarah's voice carried the weight of emotion she'd been carrying for 2 weeks. "You saved my life. If you hadn't stopped, if you hadn't known what to do, someone else would have helped," Vince interrupted, uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "No, they wouldn't have. There were dozens of people there, and they all stood around taking pictures. You're the only one who acted." The business card appeared in Sarah's hand as if by magic, professional and crisp in contrast to the rough surroundings. I'm the director of Riverside Community Center. We provide services to at-risk youth and families in this area. Vince accepted the card reluctantly, studying the logo and address while his mind processed the implications. A community center meant programs, budgets, bureaucracy, all the institutional machinery he'd been avoiding since his discharge from the army. The reason I've been looking for you, Sarah continued, isn't just to say thank you, though that was important to me. And my daughter, I have a proposition. The word proposition sent warning signals through Vince's consciousness. In his experience, propositions usually meant someone wanted something he didn't want to give, or was offering something that came with strings attached. I'm listening, he said cautiously. We have a bicycle repair program at the center. Donated. Bikes that we fix up and give to families who need transportation. The volunteer who was running it had to move away last month, and we haven't been able to replace him. Sarah paused, choosing her words carefully. I saw how you were working. On those tools, you have good hands, careful attention to detail. And Maya told me something that's been staying with me. She said you understood about being scared for your mama. That suggests you might understand the families we serve. The job offer was unexpected, surreal in its ordinariness. Vince had been avoiding employment for 3 years, partly from depression and partly from the complicated bureaucracy involved in working without a permanent address. But the idea of fixing bicycles for children carried an appeal that surprised him with its intensity. I don't have an address, he said, testing the boundaries of the offer. No permanent residence, no phone, no references. We can work with that. There's a transitional housing program we partner with, and we can provide a work address for official purposes. The pay isn't much. It's part-time, minimum wage. But it comes with access to our meal program and basic health care through our clinic partnerships. Vince studied Sarah's face, looking for signs of pity or condescension, but finding only straightforward professionalism tinged with genuine concern. This wasn't charity disguised as opportunity. It was a real job offer based on perceived skills and need. Why? He asked. You don't know anything about me beyond 5 minutes on a sidewalk. I know you didn't hesitate to help when someone needed it. I know you have medical training and you stayed calm under pressure. I know you cared enough about a stranger's child to make sure she wasn't scared. Sarah's voice grew stronger as she spoke. And I know you're living out here instead of in a shelter or transitional housing, which suggests you value independence and self-sufficiency. Those are exactly the qualities I need in someone working with vulnerable families. The logic was sound, but Vince had been disappointed by well-meaning offers before. The transition from military to civilian life had been filled with programs and opportunities that hadn't accounted for the complex realities of trauma, bureaucracy, and the 1,000 small ways that good intentions could go wrong. I'd need to see the setup, he said finally. Meet the people, understand what's expected, of course. Why don't you come by tomorrow afternoon? I can show you around, introduce you to the staff, let you look at the bikes that need work. Sarah stood, brushing dirt from her clothes. No pressure, no commitment, just a conversation about possibilities. As she prepared to leave, Vince found himself with an unexpected question. Your daughter, Maya, how is she? She's good. Still talks about you, still asks when she'll see you again. She calls you her angel man. Sarah smiled at the memory. She'll be excited to know I found you. Tell her I said thank you for the picture. It's the nicest thing anyone's given me in a long time. Sarah nodded, understanding that the simple acknowledgement carried weight beyond its words. As she walked back toward her car, she felt the lightness that comes with completing a difficult task, mixed with anxiety about what came next. Behind her, Vince sat holding Maya's drawing and Sarah's business card, 2 pieces of paper that represented a bridge between the world he'd left behind and a future he hadn't dared to imagine. The tools in his canvas bag suddenly felt like possibilities instead of mere survival implements. Tomorrow, he would visit a community center and consider rejoining the world of schedules and responsibilities and regular human interaction. Tonight, he would sleep under the stars, with a child's artwork pressed carefully between the pages of his worn notebook, proof that sometimes heroes were made not by seeking glory, but by simply showing up when showing up mattered most. The Riverside Community Center occupied a converted warehouse in a neighborhood that straddled the line between gentrification and decay, where food trucks served artisanal tacos next to vacant lots filled with weeds and broken glass. The building's brick exterior had been painted a cheerful yellow that couldn't quite disguise the industrial bones beneath. But the energy radiating from within suggested something vital and purposeful. Vince approached the entrance with the same careful reconnaissance he'd learned in the army, noting exit routes, assessing the character of people entering and leaving, gauging the general atmosphere before committing to engagement. What he saw encouraged him. Families with children, teenagers with backpacks, elderly individuals moving with the purposeful stride of people who belonged somewhere. Sarah met him at the front desk, her professional smile genuine but tinged with nervousness. She'd spent the morning second-guessing her impulsive job offer, wondering if she'd let gratitude override common sense. But seeing Vince in the daylight, noting the way he'd taken time to clean up as much as possible for this visit, she felt reassured about her instincts. "Ready for the tour?" she asked. The interior defied expectations established by the warehouse exterior. The main floor had been divided into activity areas, a computer lab where teenagers worked on homework and job applications, a kitchen where volunteers prepared meals and taught cooking classes, a childcare area where mothers could leave their children while attending GED classes or job training sessions. "We serve about 300 families," Sarah explained as they walked through the spaces. "Everything from emergency food assistance to job placement to after-school programs. The idea is wraparound services, addressing multiple needs so families can achieve stability." Vince nodded, recognizing the military logic of comprehensive support systems. The center reminded him of the best FOBs he'd served on in Afghanistan, places where different units work together toward common objectives rather than competing for resources or recognition. They paused at the entrance to a large room filled with bicycles in various states of repair. Dozens of them, ranging from children's bikes with training wheels to adult mountain bikes, all awaiting the attention of someone with mechanical skills and patience. "This is where you'd be working," Sarah said. The previous volunteer organized. "Everything by repair needs. Basic tune-ups here, more complex problems over there, bikes ready for distribution along that wall." The organization impressed Vince. Someone had understood that efficiency required system, that random good intentions weren't enough to help families who needed reliable transportation to jobs, schools, and medical appointments. "What kind of tools do you have?" he asked, moving toward a workbench that looked professionally equipped. "Donated by a bike shop that closed last year. The owner said he'd rather see them used for something good than sold to pay creditors." Sarah watched as Vince examined the tools with the careful attention of someone who understood their capabilities. "Do you think you could work with this setup? It's better equipped than most shops I've seen." Vince picked up a spoke wrench, testing its weight and precision. These are good tools. Whoever maintained them knew what they were doing. The bike storage area led to a small office where records were kept of repairs completed and bicycles distributed. Sarah showed him the simple computer system used to track inventory and match families with appropriate bicycles, explaining the process for determining need and ensuring proper fit. "Most of our clients are working families," she explained. "Parents who need reliable transportation to jobs that don't pay enough for car ownership. Kids who need safe bikes to get to school or after-school programs. We also work with social services to provide bikes for foster children and families transitioning out of homelessness." The last category hit closer to home than Vince was prepared for. But he understood the logic. A bicycle represented independence, mobility, the ability to access opportunities that might not exist within walking distance. As they toured the rest of the facility, Vince began to understand the community center's role as a hub connecting various services and programs. Sarah introduced him to staff members who managed different aspects of the operation. Maria, who ran the food pantry with military precision. James, who coordinated the after-school programs with the Patients of a Saint. Dr. Patricia Williams, who volunteered at the health clinic twice a week and treated everyone with equal dignity, regardless of their insurance status. Each introduction was careful, respectful, free of the patronizing undertones that often accompanied interactions between housed and unhoused individuals. Sarah had clearly briefed her staff about his situation, but the knowledge didn't translate into awkwardness or pity. The bicycle program serves about 50 families a month, Sarah explained, as they returned to the repair area. We get donations from individuals, bulk purchases from grants, and bikes recovered from police auctions. Your job would be getting them safe and roadworthy. Vince examined a child's bike that needed new brake cables and a chain adjustment, simple repairs that would transform it from a potential hazard into reliable transportation for someone's son or daughter. The work was concrete, measurable, meaningful in ways that transcended the simple mechanics of repairing bicycles. When would you need an answer, he asked. Take your time. But if you're interested, we could start next Monday. Part-time to begin with, maybe 20 hours a week, and see how it works for both of us. The transitional housing Sarah had mentioned was located 6 blocks from the community center, a former hotel converted into efficiency apartments for individuals moving from homelessness to housing. The building wasn't beautiful, but it was clean and safe, with a front desk staffed 24 hours and social services support available for residents working toward independent living. The waiting list is usually 6 months, Sarah explained, as they toured a sample unit, but we have some influence because of our partnership with the Housing Authority. I can't guarantee anything, but I can make some calls. The apartment was small, a single room with a kitchenette, a bathroom, and a window that looked out on a parking lot. But it represented luxury beyond anything Vince had imagined when he'd woken up on cardboard that morning, a door that locked, a bed, a place to store his few possessions without fear of theft or confiscation. Or what's the catch, he asked, because 3 years on the streets had taught him that offers this good always came with complications. No catch, but there are requirements. You have to be employed or in job training. You have to attend weekly meetings with a caseworker, and you have to be working toward independent housing within 18 months. It's transitional, not permanent. The requirements seemed reasonable, designed to support success rather than create obstacles. Vince found himself imagining what it would feel like to have an address again, a place where mail could be delivered, a phone number that reached a real location instead of a voicemail service he checked sporadically. As they walked back to the community center, Sarah's nervousness became more apparent. She'd been improvising since yesterday's encounter, making promises she wasn't entirely sure she could keep, but something about Vince's quiet competence convinced her that the risk was worth taking. I should tell you, she said as they reached her car. Maya is going to want to see you. She's been asking every day when she can give you that thank you card in person. The prospect of facing the little girl whose mother he'd saved brought unexpected anxiety. Vince had been avoiding children since becoming homeless, partly from shame and partly from the assumption that parents wouldn't want their kids interacting with someone who lived on the streets. I don't want to upset her, he said. You won't. She's been worried about you. Whether you have enough to eat, whether you're cold at night, whether you're lonely. Sarah's voice softened. She has a 6-year-old's faith that everything can be fixed with enough kindness. Maybe she's right. That evening, Vince returned to his temporary camp with more to think about than he'd processed in years. The job offer was real, the housing possibility tangible, the chance to rejoin productive society closer than it had been since his discharge from the army. But integration back into normal life also meant vulnerability, schedules to maintain, expectations to meet, relationships to navigate. It meant giving up the hard-won invisibility that had protected him from judgment and disappointment. As he settled onto his cardboard bed, for what might be one of his last nights sleeping rough, Vince pulled out Maya's drawing and studied it. In the dim light from a distant street lamp, the little girl had drawn him larger than life, heroic in a way that bore no resemblance to how he saw himself. Maybe it was time to try becoming the person she believed him to be. 3 weeks into his new routine at the Riverside Community Center, Vince had found a rhythm that surprised him with its sustainability. Monday through Friday, 8 to noon, he worked methodically through the endless supply of donated bicycles that needed attention. The work suited him. Mechanical problems with clear solutions, tangible results that improve people's lives in measurable ways. The small efficiency apartment had become home faster than he'd expected. Having a door that locked, a shower that worked, a refrigerator where he could store food beyond the current meal, these simple luxuries felt miraculous after 3 years of uncertainty and vulnerability. Maya had visited the community center twice, both times bringing new artwork and staying long enough to watch him work on bicycles with the fascination of a child, discovering that adults could fix broken things. Her mother had been careful about the meetings, understanding that too much. Attention might overwhelm someone still adjusting to regular human interaction. You make them like new, Maya had observed during her last visit, watching him install fresh brake cables on a purple bike destined for a 7-year-old whose family had recently moved out of a shelter. Better than new sometimes, Vince had replied. New bikes haven't been tested yet. These have been loved. The comment had made Sarah smile, recognizing wisdom in the perspective that saw value in things that had survived hardship and emerged stronger. On this particular Tuesday afternoon, Vince was working on a complex repair, a mountain bike with a damaged derailleur that required complete replacement, when the screaming started. Not the ordinary noise of children playing in the after-school program, but the sharp, terrified sound that meant something had gone seriously wrong. His military training kicked in before conscious thought, hands immediately stopping their work, as his attention focused on identifying the source and nature of the emergency. Through the open door of the bicycle workshop, he could see staff members running toward the main activity area, their faces showing the controlled panic of people trained to respond to crises. Vince followed, arriving at the scene to find a crowd gathered around a 10-year-old boy who was lying motionless on the floor of the basketball court. The child's skin had a grayish pallor, and his breathing was so shallow it was barely visible. "What happened?" Sarah demanded as she pushed through the crowd, her director's training taking over. "He was playing basketball. Then he just collapsed," replied James, the after-school coordinator. "1 minute he was running, the next minute he was down." The boy's name was Marcus, and Vince recognized him as one of the regular participants in the after-school program. A quiet kid who preferred reading to sports but had been coaxed into joining a pickup basketball game by his more athletic peers. Now he lay unconscious, his small chest rising and falling with irregular breaths that suggested his body was struggling to maintain basic functions. "Has anyone called 911?" Sarah asked, already reaching for her phone. "I did," said Maria from the food pantry. "They said 8 to 10 minutes. 8 to 10 minutes might be too long." Vince could see signs that Marcus was going into shock. The pale, clammy skin, the weak pulse visible at his neck, the way his body seemed to be shutting down non-essential functions to preserve core organs. "I need everyone to step back," Vince said, dropping to his knees beside the boy. His voice carried the authority that had commanded respect in battlefield triage situations, and the crowd automatically gave him space. Sarah started to object. Vince was the bicycle repair volunteer, not medical staff, but something in his demeanor stopped her. The gentleman who quietly fixed broken bikes had been replaced by someone who moved with clinical precision and spoke with the confidence of extensive training. Vince's hands went immediately to Marcus's neck, checking for pulse and examining the lymph nodes that might indicate infection or allergic reaction. The pulse was present but rapid and thready, suggesting cardiovascular distress. The boy's pupils were dilated but responsive to light, a good sign that suggested his brain was still receiving adequate oxygen. "Marcus, can you hear me?" Vince's voice was gentle but commanding. No response. He checked the boy's airway, tilting his head back slightly to ensure nothing was blocking his breathing passages. "Does he have any medical conditions?" Vince asked without looking up from his examination. "Diabetes, asthma, heart problems?" "His grandmother mentioned asthma when she enrolled him," Sarah replied. "But I don't think he carries an inhaler." Asthma could explain the collapse, especially if Marcus had been running hard and his airways had constricted beyond his body's ability to compensate. But the unconsciousness suggested something more serious, possibly an asthma attack severe enough to deprive his brain of oxygen. Vince positioned Marcus's head to optimize his breathing, then began the rescue breathing technique he'd used on Sarah 3 weeks earlier. But this situation was more complex. A child's physiology was different from an adult's, requiring adjustments to pressure and rhythm that he'd learned during his Army medical training. "Someone find me a first aid kit," he ordered, "and see if there's an emergency inhaler anywhere in the building. Sometimes people leave spares in their lockers or bags." The crowd dispersed into purposeful action, staff members running to check supply closets and children's backpacks for anything that might help. Sarah knelt beside Vince, watching him work with the same steady competence he'd shown during her own emergency. "How do you know how to do this?" she asked quietly. 20 years as an Army medic," Vince replied without stopping his rhythm. "Specialized in trauma and emergency response." The revelation explained so much: the calm under pressure, the diagnostic skills, the way he'd known exactly what to do when Sarah collapsed on the sidewalk. It also raised questions about how someone with such valuable skills had ended up homeless. But those questions would have to wait. Marcus's breathing began to improve under Vince's care, becoming deeper and more regular. Color started returning to his face, and his pulse strengthened. But he remained unconscious, and Vince knew that brain oxygen deprivation could cause permanent damage if not addressed quickly. James returned with a first aid kit, and Maria had found an emergency inhaler in the desk drawer of the main office, left behind by a previous participant, but still within its expiration date. "This might help," Vince said, examining the inhaler, "but I need him conscious to use it properly." He continued the rescue breathing, adjusting his technique as Marcus's body began responding. After 2 more minutes, the boy's eyelids fluttered, and he began showing signs of returning consciousness. "Marcus, can you hear me now?" Vince asked, reducing the frequency of assisted breaths as the boy's natural breathing improved. A weak nod, followed by a whispered, "Can't breathe good." "I know, buddy. We're going to help you with that." Vince showed him the inhaler. "Do you know how to use one of these?" Another nod. With Vince's assistance, Marcus was able to take several puffs from the inhaler, each one seeming to ease his breathing a little more. By the time the paramedics arrived, he was sitting up and speaking, in short sentences, though still obviously distressed. "Good work," the lead paramedic told Vince, as they prepared to transport Marcus to the hospital for further evaluation. "That rescue breathing probably prevented brain damage. You saved this kid's life." The aftermath of Marcus's collapse rippled through the community center with the kind of transformative energy that follows moments when ordinary people rise to extraordinary circumstances. Word spread quickly among staff, volunteers, and families that Vince, the quiet man who fixed bicycles and kept to himself, had saved another life, this time a child they all knew and cared about. For Vince, the attention felt simultaneously validating and overwhelming. The medical skills he'd been trained to use in combat zones had now twice proven their worth in civilian emergencies, reminding him of capabilities he'd almost forgotten during his years of invisibility on Atlanta's streets. Sarah found him in the bicycle workshop 2 hours after the paramedics had left, methodically returning to the derailleur repair he'd abandoned when Marcus collapsed. His hands were steady, but she could see the tension in his shoulders that suggested he was processing more than he was willing to discuss. "How are you doing?" she asked, settling onto the stool beside his workbench. "Fine," he replied, the automatic response of someone accustomed to deflecting concern. Then, after a moment's pause, he added, "Is the boy okay?" "Marcus is stable. They're keeping him overnight for observation, but the doctor said you probably prevented brain damage by getting oxygen to him so quickly." Sarah watched his face, noting the relief that crossed his features. "His grandmother wanted me to tell you that her family will never forget what you did." The commendation from the paramedics had been genuine. Vince's quick intervention had prevented what could have been a tragedy. But rather than basking in the recognition, he seemed more focused on returning to the familiar routine of mechanical repair. "I heard what you told the paramedics," Sarah continued, "about being an army medic for 20 years. That's quite a background for someone working part-time fixing bicycles." Vince's hands stilled on the derailleur cable. The revelation had been unavoidable in the heat of the emergency, but he'd hoped it might be forgotten in the chaos of ambulances and worried parents. "It was a long time ago," he said carefully. "Skills like that don't disappear. What you did today, what you did for me 3 weeks ago, that's not beginner's luck. That's decades of training and experience." Sarah leaned forward, her voice taking on the tone she used when discussing serious matters. "I have a proposition for you." Vince looked up from his work, recognizing the same careful formality she'd used when offering him the bicycle repair job. "The community center has been trying to start a basic first aid and emergency response program for months. Nothing fancy, just teaching our staff and regular volunteers how to handle medical emergencies until professional help arrives. We've been looking for someone qualified to lead it." The offer was logical, building on demonstrated competence and addressing a clear need. But it also represented a level of visibility and responsibility that made Vince uncomfortable. "I don't have current certifications," he said. "My medical training was military-specific, focused on combat injuries and field conditions." "Which means you're overqualified for teaching CPR and basic emergency response to community center staff," Sarah replied with a smile. "We can help you get whatever civilian certifications are required. The Red Cross offers instructor training, and there are grants available for programs that serve low-income communities." The conversation was interrupted by a commotion in the main area, children and parents arriving for the evening programs, word spreading quickly about the afternoon's drama and Vince's role in resolving it. Several parents approached the bicycle workshop specifically to express their gratitude, treating him with a respect that felt foreign after years of being invisible. "You're the man who saved Marcus," said one mother, introducing herself as Mrs. Washington. "And Sarah told me you're the one who saved her life too. My kids play here every day after school. Thank you for keeping them safe." The accumulating recognition created a momentum that felt beyond Vince's control. He'd spent 3 years avoiding attention, and now circumstances seemed determined to thrust him into increasingly visible roles within the community. That evening, Marcus's grandmother, Mrs. Johnson, arrived at the community center carrying a casserole dish and determination to meet the man who'd saved her grandson's life. She was a woman in her 70s, with the bearing of someone accustomed to being heard, and she wasn't leaving without expressing her gratitude properly. 20 years I've been raising that boy since his mama got sick," she told Vince, pressing the still warm casserole into his hands. "He's all the family I got left, and you gave him back to me today. How do I thank someone for that?" Vince, overwhelmed by the depth of her emotion, could only manage, "I'm glad he's okay, Mom. He wants to see you, Mrs. Johnson continued. Keeps asking about the man who helped him breathe. Would you visit him at the hospital? The request felt simultaneously honoring and terrifying. Vince had spent years avoiding the kind of personal connections that created obligations and expectations. But the image of a 10-year-old boy asking for him was impossible to dismiss. "I'll come by tomorrow," he promised. As the evening wound down and the community center emptied, Sarah and Vince found themselves alone in the main area, surrounded by the comfortable disorder of a space that had been filled with life and activity throughout the day. "You know what I realized today?" Sarah said, stacking chairs and turning off lights as they prepared to close. "When you saved my life, I thought it was about me and Maya. One good deed, one act of kindness. But watching you with Marcus, seeing how naturally you stepped in, I understand now that it's who you are. You're someone who helps people. It's not what you do sometimes, it's who you are all the time." The observation struck deeper than Vince expected. For 3 years, he'd defined himself by his failures, his inability to save his wife, his descent into homelessness, his retreat from meaningful human connection. But Sarah's words suggested an alternative narrative, one in which his essential character had remained intact, despite circumstances that had stripped away everything else. "Sarah asked me about teaching first aid," he said suddenly. "I've been thinking about it, and I think I'd like to try, not just for the staff, but maybe for the families too. Parents, teenagers, anyone who might find themselves in a situation where knowing what to do could save someone's life." Sarah smiled, recognizing the significance of his decision. "We'll make it work. Whatever you need, space, equipment, certification, support. This community needs what you have to offer." As they walked out together into the Atlanta evening, Vince felt the strange lightness that comes with accepting rather than resisting change. 2 medical emergencies had revealed capabilities he'd forgotten he possessed, and the community's response had shown him that heroism wasn't about seeking recognition. It was about being present when presence mattered. Tomorrow, he would visit a 10-year-old boy who wanted to thank him for helping him breathe. Next week, he would begin studying for civilian medical certifications that would allow him to teach life-saving skills to people who might never need them, but would be grateful to have them if they did. For the first time in 3 years, Vince Henderson was no longer just surviving. He was living with purpose, and that purpose was exactly what it had always been: helping people when they needed help most. 6 months later, the photograph sat in a simple frame on the mantel of Vince's studio apartment. Not the transitional housing unit he'd initially occupied, but a real apartment in a modest building 2 miles from the community center, complete with a lease in his name and a mailbox that received bills and correspondence addressed to Vincent R. Henderson. The picture had been taken at the community center's annual family barbecue. A casual shot that captured Sarah laughing at something Maya had whispered in her ear, while Vince stood nearby, holding a plate of food and wearing an expression of contentment that would have seemed impossible to anyone who'd known him during his years on the streets. Maya was taller now, her 7-year-old legs allowing her to keep up better when she accompanied her mother on weekend visits to Vince's apartment. She'd appointed herself as his official art director, covering his refrigerator with drawings that documented their growing friendship, pictures of bicycles and birthday parties, of Vince teaching first aid classes and Maya learning to ride. The purple bike he'd repaired for her. "Mr. Vince," she'd announced during her most recent visit, "you need more decorations. This place is too plain." She wasn't wrong. The apartment was functional but sparse, furnished with donated items and necessities rather than personal touches that might make it feel like home. But for someone who'd spent 3 years owning nothing but what he could carry, even basic furniture felt like luxury. The first aid instructor certification had led to other opportunities. Vince now taught CPR and basic emergency response twice a week at the community center, and his classes had become so popular that they'd expanded to serve other organizations throughout the city. The Red Cross had recruited him as a volunteer trainer, and he'd been invited to speak at conferences about community emergency preparedness. More importantly, he'd trained 47 people in life-saving skills, including Marcus Johnson, who'd insisted on taking the course as soon as he turned 11. The boy had recovered completely from his asthma attack, though he now carried an inhaler everywhere and had learned to recognize the warning signs that preceded an episode. "I want to help people like you helped me," Marcus had explained when Vince asked why he was so interested in learning first aid. "Maybe I can't be a medic like you were, but I can learn to do the important stuff." The community center had become more than a workplace. It had become the center of Vince's social universe. Sarah had included him in staff meetings and strategic planning sessions, valuing his insights about serving vulnerable populations. His perspective as someone who'd experienced homelessness firsthand had influenced program development in ways that surprised everyone, including himself. The bicycle repair program had evolved too. What had started as simple maintenance had grown into a comprehensive program that included basic bicycle safety education, maintenance workshops for parents and children, and a youth employment initiative that trained teenagers in mechanical skills while providing them with part-time income. But the most significant change was harder to quantify. Vince had stopped talking to pigeons. Not because he no longer saw them during his morning walks, but because he was talking to people instead. Neighbors, colleagues, the grocery store clerk who'd learned his name, the bus driver who saved him a seat during his regular Tuesday trips to the VA hospital for routine medical care. The conversation with his caseworker at the housing authority had been brief and professional. Vince's income from his various teaching positions, combined with part-time work at a local bike shop that had recruited him based on his reputation, was sufficient to qualify for independent housing. His 18 months of successful transitional living had demonstrated stability and reliability. "You're one of our success stories," the caseworker had told him during his final check-in. "Not everyone makes the transition this smoothly." Success. The word felt strange applied to his life, but Vince had begun to understand that success could be measured in small victories rather than grand achievements. Getting up each morning with somewhere to be, having people who depended on him, sleeping in a bed rather than on cardboard, contributing something valuable to his community. The evening routine had become as important as the work itself. Vince would return to his apartment after teaching an evening first aid class, heat up leftovers from the meal Sarah had insisted he take home from the community center's kitchen, and settle at his small dining table with a cup of coffee and the notebook he'd carried throughout his homeless years. The entries had changed character over the months. Instead of survival observations and weather patterns, he now recorded the progress of his students, notes about program improvements, and reflections on the strange journey that had brought him from invisibility to purpose. Today, Maya asked, "If I was happy," he'd written recently, "I realized I didn't know how to answer because I'd forgotten what happy felt like. But sitting in my own apartment, writing in my notebook, while dinner cooked in my own kitchen, I think this might be what it feels like." The Saturday visits with Sarah and Maya had become routine, though Sarah was careful to maintain boundaries that respected Vince's independence while acknowledging the unique relationship that had grown from their first dramatic encounter. Maya considered him honorary family, but Sarah understood that recovery required space to develop one's own identity apart from the circumstances that had created the connection. "She talks about you during the week," Sarah had mentioned during one of their conversations. "Not constantly, but when something reminds her of you. Yesterday she saw an ambulance and told her teacher about the man who saved her mama and taught her about helping people. The impact extended beyond their small circle. Marcus's grandmother had become one of Vince's most enthusiastic advocates, recommending his first aid classes to anyone who would listen and bringing him homemade meals, with the regularity of someone who'd adopted him into her extended family. "You gave me my grandson back," she'd told him recently. "That makes you family, whether you like it or not." Other families had their own stories. The mother who'd learned CPR in his class and used it when her toddler choked on a toy. The teenager who'd applied first aid training when his friend was injured in a skateboarding accident. The elderly man who'd recognized the signs of a heart attack in his neighbor and called for help in time to save his life. Each story confirmed what Vince had learned in the army, that ordinary people could do extraordinary things when they had the right training and the courage to act. His role was simply to provide the training and encourage the courage. As winter approached Atlanta, with its mild but definite chill, Vince found himself thinking about the anniversary of his rescue of Sarah and Maya. 1 year since the moment that had changed everything, that had pulled him from invisibility into purpose. The viral video had been forgotten, replaced by newer heroes and fresher dramas. But the consequences continued to ripple outward in ways that couldn't be measured by social media metrics. A community center had expanded its emergency preparedness capabilities. Dozens of people had learned skills that might save lives. A little girl had learned that heroes could appear in unexpected forms. A mother had learned that gratitude could transform both the giver and the receiver. And a man who'd thought his useful life was over had discovered that sometimes the most important chapters begin when you least expect them, written by hands that have learned that dignity survives adversity, and that purpose can be found in the simple act of showing up when showing up matters most. The photograph on the mantel captured none of these complexities, showing only 3 people sharing a moment of genuine happiness at a community barbecue. But for Vince, it represented everything he'd thought he'd lost and found again: belonging, purpose, and the understanding that family could be chosen as well as born, created by acts of kindness rather than accidents of genetics. Tomorrow he would teach another first aid class, repair more bicycles, and continue the quiet work of building a life that mattered. Tonight, he would sit in his own apartment, write in his notebook, and remember what it felt like to be grateful for small miracles disguised as ordinary days.